Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Center. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations of the land on which we are now based at the University of Sydney, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging in the future. It's my great pleasure tonight, or today, or whatever time you happen to be, to welcome Lauren Johnson, who's going to talk about the donkey business, some research she's been doing recently. And she's going to be chaired by Natalie Curler, who's in the Faculty of Science at the University of Sydney, and also, just by chance, happens to work on the same topic as Lauren, though from a different perspective completely. So it's going to be a very enjoyable webinar that we have coming up. Natalie will speak first and introduce Lauren. If you wish to ask questions, please do so, but do it by using the Q&A, question and answer function in the on the bottom of your screen, and Natalie will ask the questions from there. Over to you, Natalie. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So yes, I just go on to say it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lauren Johnson to give this talk today. So we're very lucky to have her take an interest in this topic. She is a leading applied economist in China-Africa trade and also in the study of the Belt and Road Initiative. And she's also studying how China's current demographic challenges are reshaping its economy. So currently, she is a senior researcher in China-Africa relations, or China-Africa sector at the South African Institute for International Affairs, SAIA, in Johannesburg, but she's actually based in Berlin. So she is working remotely from Berlin. And she's also a visiting senior lecturer at the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. And last but not least, she is a member of our very own China Studies Center at Sydney University. And this is why she's giving, or not why, but this is also part of why she's giving a talk for us today. So her background, she has a PhD from Beijing University in economics. So this probably says it all already. I mean, it's very rare for Western researchers to have such a rigorous training in China itself. And after the completion of her PhD, she was a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research at the University of Melbourne, I think between 2015 and 18. And other previous appointments of her include being a member of the ANU China Update editorial team and of cross-country research teams with the World Bank and Murdoch University and many, many others. I mean, the list is just too long for me to reproduce it here. She's widely worked in different fields, university and other sectors. And so with that kind of background, as I said, Lauren has and that's probably because she has a lot of spent a lot of time in Africa, so she has come across this donkey problem firsthand, and that's probably what caused her to take an interest in this in the topic. And so she's just published a paper on the donkey trade in Africa entitled "China, Africa, and the Market for Donkeys: Keeping the Cart Behind the Donkeys." And this paper has received a really, really good resonance. So it has been widely quoted in almost all major global news outlets. And it also, among other things, has led her to being invited as a speaker at the African Union-led Pan-African Donkey Conference that took place in Tanzania in December 2022. And Lauren's probably going to tell us a little bit later about the significance of this conference. So I'm not going to say anything about that. And one of the outcomes of this of this paper is also that a Congressional Research Service report was prepared on March 3rd, which is shortly after all this global resonance to Lawrence's paper, and this research report recommended enacting legislation that would ban the import of ejiao to the United States. So this is a major impact already to that paper, and that would be quite interesting if it came to pass, and it would also be in very sharp contrast to the Australian situation, where the agribusiness centre is actually contemplating and advocating to monetize the feral donkey population by exporting its skins to China to feed into the ejiao trade. So this already also illustrates the significance and interest that this whole ejiao topic has specifically for Australia, because of course not everybody is in agreement with this plan of exporting the Australian donkeys. So, well, I won't say any more than that, because Lauren herself is going to tell us about the global significance of the topic, but just let me emphasize once more how lucky we all are that a serious economist has taken an interest in this, because I'm also working on this topic, but I'm a historian of Chinese medicine. So my take on this is from a completely different perspective, and I really don't have a good grasp on the economy. So this is great to have somebody from that sector or from that field take up this topic and give us some information on that. So the field is all yours. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, both David and Natalie, for the introduction. I just want to add into that. I'm not 100. I haven't been everywhere. And on top of that, during this seminar, if you have any questions, I really do come from the kind of economics end, as Natalie said. And Natalie has unbelievably deep knowledge of this donkey story and the history of ejiao within China itself. So if you have a really deep question about ejiao that feeds into what I say, like, please feel free to ask either of us that question. So I'm just going to share my screen. And then we'll go from there. So it's China, Africa, and the market for donkeys. Somehow I never put these into my presentation, sorry. Now I have these sliding slides. So in any case, so just a bit of an introduction to what is ejiao for those people listening who don't know. Again, Natalie's definitely the actual deep expert there, but I'll give an introduction. And then this story of this amazing modern nexus of the donkey market. And I'll tell you exactly how, as Natalie said, how I came to learn about this, completely from outside of a traditional Chinese medicine understanding. And then what this new demand for donkeys around the world means on the ground, in this example, in Africa and East Africa. But it's not just a story of Africa, actually. It's also Pakistan, parts of India, and other places. And then the kind of regulatory challenges and opportunities that brings up. So the focus of that is Africa, because that's what I look at. And this research was funded by the South African Institute of International Affairs, which these slides are from an earlier presentation around that. But it does have that link back to Australia. As Natalie said, you've got this great dialogue going on. America's talking about banning ejiao imports, and Australia's talking about exporting donkeys to feed the ejiao industry. There's all sorts of perspectives on this. So this is really the kind of the one extreme to some extent of the Africa end, because it's where donkeys are used most traditionally. So it has really different impact. So, you've got this kind of epic donkey. And one reason I like this in the China-Africa context is mostly as a China scholar, when you talk about China, it's like China's got 8,000 years history here, 3,000 years there, kind of every time China sort of wins the history story almost. But it just doesn't in the donkey story. The donkey was first domesticated in East Africa 7,000 years ago. So they've been using donkeys for pastoral activities and to facilitate trade and to carry people for 7,000 years. And then in that cultural context, it has this amazing resonance. It carried Christ, it carried kind of Egyptian, leaders, it carried Muhammad, like just such an amazing historical legacy. So it's just not a normal animal in a cultural context. It might today be the animal of the poor, but it has this amazing kind of cultural soft power in a more passive, likable sense almost. So, now into that story at the Africa end, you have this Chinese tradition, which is, and I hate to say something Natalie might disagree with because she knows so much more. So what is ejiao? Ejiao is like a 3,000-year-old, roughly traditional Chinese medicine product, originally made in a county in Shandong province, in Dongyi County. And for most of those thousands of years until the 1980s, it was made by hand. It was made in small quantities, and it was like a product for the elite. And the elite, even like the emperor and people in Shandong, made from donkey collagen, traditionally black donkey collagen, some mineral water from some kind of spring in Shandong near Dongyi County, and a few other herbs and spices. Please don't be offended with that description, Natalie. And with that, it somehow helped clear the blood. It helped people to sleep. It kind of revitalized somehow the blood system. And it became this elite product that only like the concubines of the emperor and so on would eat. And therefore, not many donkeys were killed, both because the production was slow and the consumption was elite. So it didn't really have a big impact on donkeys themselves. Now, that all changed with opening and reform. So today, and I'll go on to why, the ejiao market, according to the Shandong Ejiao Industry Association, so the market is still based in Shandong, like that's the primary hub of it. It hasn't started to be produced all over China. It's really still got its 3,000-year-old root around Shandong. And today, roughly the market is worth, almost $8 billion. So this is a really big and kind of, wealth generating industry now. And all of that, most of that, there aren't many artificial supplements for the donkey. Most of that is driven by some level of consumption of donkey collagen from the donkey hide. And this is only like in the last decade or two. So you just imagine how many donkeys are suddenly needed for this new industry. And so this is just a picture. And so this is a slide I added into the earlier presentation yesterday. So you had this kind of, you could almost call it in the 1980s and 90s a supply shock, in that you could suddenly supply a lot more ejiao because China imported some new machinery once they opened and reformed. And they had air conditioning and all sorts of new kind of ways to sustain year-round and mass production of ejiao, which meant suddenly you could produce much more ejiao and sell to a much bigger audience. And then from 2011, an even bigger audience because of this genius product placement in a TV series called Empress in the Palace, which began in 2011. And it was about, you can see the two pictures of the ladies, kind of, these ladies would go off and eat ejiao each day to keep pretty and compete with each other for wealth and power, which in turn led many ladies in China today of wanting wealth and power and of wealth and power to kind of enter into this, luxury consumer good and even now normal consumer good of ejiao, and that would somehow help them resonate with this era of the empresses and also bring them those claimed health benefits. And so as that all developed, this is a picture of kind of variations of how ejiao can now be bought and consumed. The ejiao industry is like modern Chinese industries. It's super professional. It's very aggressive. It's an ambitious, profit-generating industry that keeps coming up with new ways for consumers to consume ejiao, which of course means new ways to consume donkeys. So that's just the reality, that these amazing consumer products also require donkeys, at least as they're produced in the original means. So this is just a kind of introduction to that. And so, what does all that mean in terms of actual donkey numbers? The numbers, as I understand them, and I haven't looked at them for years, are somewhat sketchy. But 1990, when this was all just beginning, and China was still quite young and poor, because ejiao tends to be consumed by a slightly older market. It helps people sleep, it helps their skin to age, it kind of helps stabilize blood and hormones and all sorts. So when China was young and poor in 1990, only 400,000 donkey hides were used. And of course, this was before the mass mechanization of the process. And then by 2020, rather some 5 million donkey hides were used annually. And between times from 400,000 donkeys a year to 5 million donkeys a year, of course, that affected China's own supply of donkeys, because China itself didn't keep up its donkey supply with its donkey consumption. So from as early as around 2010, you had these donkey supply constraints issues in China. All of a sudden, like, oh my God, we're producing so much ejiao, but we just don't have the supply of donkeys anymore. So from 2010, you had this amazing new global industry and global world of trade in donkeys, which has only, I guess, historically previously happened across borders, and kind of, you take the donkey from, I don't know, Kenya to Tanzania and you sell it across the border or something, but not shipped like across the world sort of thing. This is a whole new kind of big scaled industry on the commodification of the donkey. So today there's around 5 million demanded annually, and only 2 of those come from China. So you need 3 million donkeys from abroad. So where does this whole new market for donkeys come from? Like, where are the donkeys? And just a slight bit of background again, sorry. So this is a story of like the demand. So you can just see how, especially from 2006 on, this is after China has joined the WTO, incomes are rising fast, people are getting richer, and now you have this quite elevated per capita income, and that's the average. So the higher income areas in Shanghai and Beijing and Tianjin and Shenzhen, obviously much higher again. So they have disposable income to buy historical consumer goods, and in this case now ejiao. So that's one driver. And then this is the other factor that is kind of associated to that. As I said, that the average consumer is older than, like a young girl per se. Maybe girls trying to get pregnant might use them. They help with pregnancy and so on, but also with aging. And so you see this, rising share of older Chinese also will drive this new demand for ejiao, which is great, except for the fact that the supply of donkeys doesn't easily keep up. So this Chinese donkey market shock in 2010, or from 2010 rather than a kind of a big one. So pre-2010 in China, as I understand it, like a whole donkey skin could be bought for around renminbi 500. And by 2015, there were cases where a donkey skin was being sold for 26,000 renminbi. So you can just see this is in 5 years, just a remarkable situation of kind of crazy price inflation as demand for donkeys shot up, but the supply of donkeys was just imploding. And the reason for that, I think, is on another side, but, donkeys are very slow breeders. They're particular breeders. They have maybe, 1, 2, if they're lucky, 3 foals in a lifetime. And they're not animals the way a pig or the way chickens can be encouraged to produce eggs and pigs to reproduce and so on isn't the case of the donkey. It's very, very hard to turn a donkey into a mass producing, baby producing animal. So hence these supply issues. And so, the price of the ejiao has also risen and so on and so on. So you just see all these profits, and the ejiao industry is all like, well, where do we get where are we going to get all these donkeys from? And hence they looked abroad. So global market for donkeys emerges. Sorry, there's a slight error in that slide. But, the background to this is, of course, that where you had this amazing transformation of the donkey market in China, you didn't have that in other places. So all the while the demand, and, China's no longer using donkeys to carry things on a cart like they might have 50 or 100 years ago. They've replaced those with mechanized vehicles. They've brought people down from the mountains into the cities. They don't need donkeys in the cities. So their traditional demand for donkeys is gone. Now it really feeds into ejiao, except in some remote mountain areas. And whereas in what you see in Africa, and this is one study from South Africa, Binder, that just said that they found that, with a real focus on rural poor, in Africa instead, the donkey, facilitates employment opportunities. This is both directly and indirectly, because while the donkey does the work, if the donkey's helping someone to carry water, cart goods, get goods to market, this both creates income directly and it frees up labor hours. So instead of having to spend all day walking to and from a water well, somebody can go in the morning, get the water with the donkey, come back, and then they have the rest of the day themselves to go off and work somewhere else. So the donkey supports directly and indirectly labor. It enhances access to markets. It gets goods to and from the market in greater volumes. That provides income and savings opportunities. And that, fosters all this home ownership, home extension. This is in South Africa's rural areas are obviously slightly richer than rural areas in remote Ethiopia or so on, where the donkey can simply be a basic means of transport, even for people in times of drought or in Sudan and so on. As people are fleeing, the donkey is fundamental. It doesn't need a road. It doesn't need lots of water. It carries people. So this is the kind of income side in South Africa. But elsewhere, like today in Sudan, the donkey would be carrying refugee after refugee out of this war zone and hopefully to somewhere safe. So I took these pictures in Ethiopia myself. This is kind of outside of, where was this? This is on a road somewhere outside of Mekelle, maybe. I was in a car on the way to somewhere, and these are just random. So you see, this is the role of the donkey in Africa. Or at least in Ethiopia, not everywhere. And I just wanted to communicate so you can see this donkey is just such an integral part of normal working life. And it goes along with the girls, it goes along with women, it's carrying all these goods. It's kind of, it's almost an invisible part of daily life. It's just there, it helps everyone. It carries the kids, it carries water. And then this is, I focus on the Ethiopia context here because this is where I learned, like Natalie said, I'm actually a China-Africa economist. And I was in Ethiopia around, there's an old ancient kind of Orthodox Christian town called Lalibela, and also another town called Gondar, which is a bit of an old university town. And I was just talking to random people, China, Africa, the tour guides, all sorts. And they really didn't like China. And I was so curious. I was just trying to get my head why, all these roads, all these people-to-people exchanges, scholarships. And the issue was the donkey. They were just so disgusted that, I just showed you those pictures and you could see these donkeys part of everyone's life. They're Orthodox Christians. To them, the donkey carried Jesus. It helps the poor. You see this kind of beautiful backdrop of these mountains, and there's just been donkeys walking along those mountains for 7,000 years. All of a sudden, rich China comes in and wants to take these donkeys and just slaughter them for the gelatin in the donkey hide. And they were I just got this sense of disgust. And I was like, wow, this is just such an interesting and potentially damaging nexus. So that got me interested in this sort of topic and its potential to affect China-Africa relations. So, you see, this is just another supply, the supply of donkeys. So, or maybe, so Africa now today is home to almost 2/3. So when China had this supply shock, its ejiao industry had a donkey supply shock from 2010, obviously Africa is where they went. It's home to almost 2/3 of the world's donkeys. And Ethiopia, where I learned about this, is like, the really bit of a donkey superpower. It has something like 20% of total donkey stock. So the per capita presence of donkeys in Ethiopia, which has a much smaller population than China, is enormous. And the idea that China just came in and started taking them just seemed really offensive to people there, and it piqued my interest. I found it so interesting as a trade scholar. Because this is another picture, just to kind of, I've taken this from another study, and you can just see, so kind of China's got lots of donkeys. This is by number, but Ethiopia really on a kind of per capita area basis, per capita population is really a peak, and they were just disgusted. I was shocked. So that led to this. So I took this quote from Natalie, one of Natalie's studies. So into the kind of commodification of donkeys, for donkeys, the welfare effects of the increased demand for donkey hide, especially given their sensitivity, are many. This is like for donkeys themselves, like the way they're killed and the emergence of this trade and so on. So that's a kind of, best and around the idiosyncratic, opportunistic and irregular supply chain, biosecurity hazards, like this whole amazing sort of socioeconomic nexus of the donkey trade is what has emerged care of this amazing expansion of the ejiao industry and this ability for the average Chinese to enjoy what was an elite historical product. So though Ethiopia is the hub of donkeys, Kenya is also quite rich in donkeys, and Kenya is a bit of an interesting study because Kenya is more market oriented. So I'd say there's kind of three interesting Africa stories. I mean, there's many, actually, many. But Ethiopia, in terms of the cultural power and offensiveness of the donkey trade, Kenya is really the heart of the attempts to formalize the donkey trade. And so when China went out to look for donkeys, it signed agreements, or at least the ejiao industry did, with various countries about exporting donkeys. I'll go into that. Many of those have been shut down, but Kenya, they tried to shut down the donkey trade, and the donkey traders were able to take that decision to the highest court, and it got reinstalled. So these donkey kind of slaughterhouses and so on still exist, whereas in other countries they're ostensibly shut down, they are shut down or so on, but not in Kenya. In Kenya, it's still going for better and for worse. So the largest one, and possibly even the largest donkey slaughterhouse for China in Africa, is this Gold Ox Kenya Limited. And you can see it's a bit remote. It's, well away from the coast and so on. And, the number of donkeys slaughtered, there's 4 main donkey slaughterhouses that slaughter donkeys for China in this agreement. But almost 90% of them come from just that one slaughterhouse, Gold Ox. And so that's running, it's legal and so on. And this is one additional study on just the donkeys in Kenya, which I don't know how accurate these numbers are. The paper is from Gemma Carter's paper. But the reason I highlight this, so you have many being sold, and then some just die off, some are stolen. So the reason that the donkey trade, I mean, it's such a complicated nexus, but the reason it's become a big story in Africa is not just because of this formalization of trade and slaughter of a donkey that has cultural value, but because the price of donkeys is now so high that there's all this donkey market theft. And so you see, at least here, there's like reported 27 donkeys were stolen. And these donkeys, this is just in Kenya, and Kenya's, at least by compared to rural Ethiopia or, even rural Tanzania, Kenya's quite well off, but the donkeys are still being stolen. And at night, villagers might just go to bed, and in the morning they wake up and, some gangs have been through and stolen the donkey, killed the donkey, and sent the hide off illegally to China. So, you know, China really couldn't get enough donkeys. And so they've, on the one hand, they kind of created these formal slaughterhouses, but around all that, this whole slaughtering of donkeys just became an illegal trade as much as any illicit wildlife trade. And there were fears. And the Pan-African Donkey Conference that I went to in December really, like, you know, tried to talk about that these slaughterhouses, on the one hand, you know, they encourage trade, and this is a form of foreign exchange revenue. But on the other hand, around them, they seem to encourage and facilitate all these illegal donkey thefts. And, you know, villages, women wake up and they have like no donkey left. They literally, the women become the donkey again. And so this trade has this amazing sort of unequal consequence. So on the one hand, it's great. You have demand for donkeys in China, and people in Africa can sell donkeys and make money. It's a new market. But as Natalie's research will know more about, you know, the actual slaughter of the donkey, especially the illicit slaughter, can be quite cruel. And if a donkey's traded illegally, then it typically will be slaughtered even more harmfully. And in some cases, you know, countries have banned the trade in donkeys, and then donkeys will just be taken overland for like thousands of kilometers almost to somewhere they can be sorted, or just put in a truck and so on. And then for donkey owners and donkey users, this market for donkeys, I'm sorry I don't have more data. I'm trying to pack in the story here rather than focus on, say, one village in Africa, or, you know, one kind of production site in China. I'm trying to give everyone the big story. And then that will help at least the Australian side, especially, understand the bigger picture. So then for donkey users and owners, you know, once this Chinese demand came in, people could no longer afford their own donkey. They couldn't afford, like, their donkeys would get stolen. They couldn't afford a new one. Women become the donkey again. Women have to carry the water. The girls have to leave school and help back in the house again. Like, just a horrible, it's as if this market for donkeys came too early for Africa's own poverty alleviation story. And rural areas get cut off from the market. And these donkeys, of course, are the most sustainable form of transportation almost that you can have. Like, you don't need to import oil. You don't need to build a road. You don't need much water. They're like a climate change dream, but they're disappearing. And even in China itself, the poor and the old can't afford, the poor and the sick, they can't afford ejiao even. Like, the medicinal value of ejiao is even out of reach to them. And so, you know, I then finally, this whole kind of story piqued my interest, because China's now really pushing into agricultural trade between China and Africa to help its own food security, and all sorts, to help Africa generate foreign exchange, grow food for its own young rising populations. And yet at the same time, they're like destroying their agricultural area soft power with this market for donkeys. And I just give a bit of that. So as this trade emerged legally and illegally, you see all these countries like Cote d'Ivoire ban the slaughter and export of donkeys. Tanzania put a 10-year ban on slaughter and sale of donkeys in 2022. Nigeria has this proposed law. Ethiopia banned the slaughter and export all the way from 2017. And, you know, but there's these kind of there's ways around that. And some countries ban it, then it comes back, and so on. So it's so contentious, and there's always a few people wanting to export donkeys, but the majority of the people seem to be against it. And so, you know, in Egypt's case, they only will export male donkey hides, not female donkey hides, and so on. So at the Pan-African Donkey Conference, they brought everyone together, and they're like, you know, this just isn't working. We all have different policies, and donkeys are being traded across borders. They're being stolen across borders. If we don't work out a consistent framework, then all the donkeys will go. And they're trying to work in that direction. And I just think it's in China's own interest to work with them, because of this generating kind of so much hatred, almost, at least what I heard in Ethiopia especially. So, you know, and at the Pan-African Donkey Conference, people were like, some of the male speakers were like, our wives are literally being forced to become the donkey again once these donkeys are gone. And for what? Like, why would China do that? And what these conclusions were a little bit really for that donkey conference, in fact. And the thing was that most of these donkey activists, donkey vets, agricultural specialists, poverty specialists, they really don't know China and the ejiao supply chain and how to work with them to make this industry work. That's exactly what Natalie knows, that supply chain amazingly. And, you know, to kind of work to foster more of a sustainable demand for ejiao, so you don't get this explosive kind of Chinese frenzy and demand and interest and excitement that just creates these invisible spillovers somewhere that do actual damage even to China, let alone to the places getting the spillover. And so to kind of feed this into the China-Africa chain. So for people listening who are China scholars, now we kind of come back to like, what is the ejiao supply chain, which really is Natalie's area. So the donkey sin imports, the stolen ones, you know, have resulted in, sorry, okay, now I'm here. So you have not only do these stolen donkeys and this cheap donkeys from Africa have a negative effect on most people in the African context, not all, not the donkey entrepreneurs, but that lower price even seems to diminish China's own donkey market. You know, there's one angle of that, which is a highly sophisticated, very well kind of resourced, lots of IVF, donkey breeding, all the rest. But in the traditional sense of the donkey farms around Shandong and Inner Mongolia, even their price they get for donkeys has fallen. So it just has a negative effect on the supply chain. And, you know, all the while, so I was just kind of looking at how can China turn that into a positive story and common prosperity, even for the areas in China that are traditionally still using donkeys. This alone, you know, put a floor price for donkeys so that donkeys themselves aren't cheap anymore, and that might somehow help to elevate the practices of the ejiao industry itself in a way that's sustainable for donkeys and for donkey farmers, just like fair trade cocoa, fair trade donkeys. And in terms of this slide was very much for the African Donkey Conference, which is just to explain that it's not this fragmented market. ejiao is dominated by this one, a fascinating market unto itself, which is Dong ejiao dominates 60% of production. So the kind of company that goes back to the imperial times is still the dominant producer. So that makes it as complex as is easy to target these negotiations, because obviously that makes Dong ejiao, whatever is Dong ejiao, is really the kind of future of the donkey, even in Africa. So somehow, some sort of, it'd just be great if Dong ejiao could negotiate with the African Union livestock people I met, almost to how to make this thing work for everyone. So that was really like, there's three major producers, but it's that one that ultimately, hopefully, can somehow transform that industry if possible. And then this was another suggestion to the Africa end, which is to use these, you know, here you have Li Bingbing and how she has worked to reduce demand for rhino horns and ivory and so on. The same in principle could be done for donkeys, just to illustrate the negative effect it's having on Africa's poor, on Africa's women, rural women especially, and therefore the negative impact it's having on China, Africa, and this whole push even to elevate China's own food security via Africa this donkey trade might even be undermining that, like just so ridiculously negative for both ends. So like fair trade campaign for donkeys, sustainable donkey farming. Donkey farming is a science unto itself, and it seems incredibly hard to get donkeys to breed like you would others. So it does seem a little bit like without artificial supplements or until IVF, whatever donkey breeding can be perfected, that it does seem that the focus should be on reducing the demand for ejiao, like somehow keeping ejiao demand within the scheme of donkey supply and peaceful China-Africa relations. And into that, like, you know, Xi himself, when he was just the vice president, not as president now, visited Africa and South Africa in 2010, and he promised to optimize and enlarge the scale of China-Africa trade, you know, really to promote mutual trust, common development. This is all before the Belt and Road, before he was president, he promised that. And I just think this donkey story needs to be inserted into that. And there's, and then, you know, even when Xi became the president, his first visit to Africa, his first overseas trip was Russia, Tanzania, South Africa, and Congo. And after COVID, the very first head of state she met was the leader of Tanzania, Suluhu. And so you see this importance. The donkey conference was held in Tanzania. And I was like, Tanzania, China, very important relationship. So somehow maybe there can be like a Tanzanian donkey action agenda, just because Tanzania is so resonant for China in a political economy history for all sorts of reasons. And Tanzania has tried and tried. I don't elaborate it here, but the Tanzania China donkey story is fascinating. They tried everything. They tried to formalize it. They tried the donkey trade, and they gave up, and they just said, that's it. We're banning it. We're not doing it anymore. So really there just needs to be such a improvement. And whether Australia should step in and provide donkeys, whether China wants Australia's donkeys, whatever, is another story. But at least Australian trade officials might best be aware of this background. And, you know, if they're not, this picture I took in Ethiopia on that same visit, it's taken not far from Lalibela, that heartland of Orthodox Ethiopian Christianity. And, you know, this is really like, you know, when the donkey's gone and being consumed for ejiao, this is what happens to women. They have to put all that stuff on their back again. It really turns women into the donkey again. And that doesn't, like if fostering women's skin and health in China leads to such poor health outcomes for women in Africa, I just don't think that's a great trade. But hopefully with better people-to-people dialogue and trade discussions, that can be improved. And just to add, at the end of this month, there's a big China-Africa trade discussion and forum in Hunan province. And I hope that somewhere into that, there'll be something on this that feeds into that and makes this story a much more win-win one for both ends. I don't know if I'm at time. I don't know if that's about 40 minutes. Is that David and Natalie? Does that work?
Why not?
Is that, how long have I been with?
You're okay. You're okay. Don't worry. We'll pass back to Natalie now to ask you some questions and to chair the question. Natalie, I see that there are some questions in the chat.
So yeah, do you want to
Q&A? Maybe we can remind people to use the quick Q&A.
Unshare your screen, or you need the screen to answer the questions?
Oh no, sorry, I can do that. Oh.
So well, thanks a lot for this really interesting talk and an excellent overview over the problematic of ejiao and the donkey trade. So what shall I do? Shall I steal the first question, or shall I read out the questions? I'll start with we don't have many questions. Please let me know if there are more questions. I think I'll start with the questions from the audience. So the first comment that got in is from Ray Tikia. I hope I pronounce it right. It says, while donkey hide may be used to revitalize human blood, sure, in TCM, one important way to revitalize blood is to revitalize the human qi. And there are thousands of materia medica that can be used to achieve this. So this is a TCM question, or it's not really a question, it's a comment. So I think, would you like to speak to that? Otherwise, I'll take the TCM question, but you said.
Yeah, I certainly don't know about substitutes for different TCM. So you can, that's definitely your question.
Okay, let's, yeah, okay, so then I'll just read the other comments, but they're to everyone, so everybody knows already. So Abel says this was an excellent presentation, and Daniel Tan also agrees with Abel's. It's an excellent presentation, and it's great to understand the underlying drivers for ejiao and donkey demand and how this results in consequences on donkey numbers in China and Africa. So this is the comments that you got right now. So thank you.
Can I just say one thing on the supplementary story? Like, I don't have a clue about TCM and why donkeys and all the rest. What I gathered from the Pan-African Donkey Conference is that, rightly or wrongly, those participants didn't have the feeling, and there were some quite high-level ones, ministers, African Union officials, and so on. They didn't have the feeling that ejiao necessarily was scientifically proven to be realizing those objectives. And that in itself, I don't think they cared about. They don't care if anyone wants to consume something and it works or it doesn't work. They don't care. But what they cared about was they thought, but if you're consuming our donkeys and it doesn't even work, like if you're killing our donkeys to cure cancer, maybe. But if you're killing our donkeys and you can't even tell us that it's for a good reason, it was like the icing on the insult cake. So if there are substitutes, based on the fact that these communities in Africa had zero confidence that their donkeys were being killed for any good reason whatsoever, which at least if there was a good reason, they might, if you're finding a cure to whatever, great. But if you're just killing them for something that no one's sure of, it was even more offensive. It just seemed much more offensive. So that might itself be worth some sort of discussion within the context of the discussions.
Okay, yes, that's a good point. Maybe this allows me to add something from the Chinese medicine perspective. So I mean, there's of course this whole question, which we're not going to discuss today, whether Chinese medicine works or not. And if you look at Chinese medicine from the biomedical context, then you will look at active ingredients in the drugs. And well, yes, if you look at gelatin and collagen, it has very little active ingredients. And people who do study the active ingredients of Chinese drugs, they agree with this. They aren't, I mean, it's just very hard to prove the efficacy of ejiao in terms of active ingredients. But this is not how you can prove the validity of Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine has its own epistemology and its own way of reasoning how these things work, and you can't reduce it back to scientific explanations. So if you take the stand of like, we only accept the scientific explanation of why ejiao works or not, then it's just never gonna, it's never gonna meet the Chinese clinician who has a very different idea about whether it works or not. But that being said, there are literally thousands of other drugs, as Ray has rightly pointed out, that could be used to substitute ejiao. And why isn't this being done? And this is, of course, the very interesting development that's going on globally, not only in China, but worldwide, which is called by historians of medicine, it's called pharmaceuticalization. So it's basically people are self-medicalizing. They are being directly targeted by the pharma industry to go out and buy medicines and cure themselves. So if you go to your Chinese doctor, then actually, so ejiao is very, very powerful, but it has a very narrowly defined case of illnesses where it actually would be applied. And if the person doesn't have the money to pay for ejiao, there would be literally like hundreds of other drugs that could be used to substitute. And it would be used for a very small range of symptoms and conditions anyways. But the ejiao industry, as you've said in the beginning of your paper, they very cleverly expanded the range of instances where you need ejiao into like everything. It's become a panacea, which is totally outside of the. It kind of makes sense in the theory of Chinese medicine, but it kind of really doesn't. But because the ejiao, because of this pharmaceuticalization, because people go out and buy medicines themselves in China, but also in the West. I mean, we go out and buy aspirin and vitamins and whatnot to medicalize ourselves. And Chinese people do the same. And so if they're being told by the very powerful ejiao industry machine that this is what they should be doing to cure themselves, then they're not going to substitute it because they are not doctors. They don't know how to substitute it. And they're believing this whole, they're believing the advertising. So this is a problem not of Chinese medicine, but it's a problem of profit-oriented marketing of pharmaceutical industries. It's a very, it's not, the problem is not TCM. The problem is profit-driven marketing campaigns.
Yeah. And, you know, no, honestly, I did not get the sense that anybody at this conference was judging TCM. They don't have any issue with, you know, they have their own historical herbs and, you know, witch doctors and so on. Like, there's no judgment of TCM. There's just a simply, well, we need our donkeys, and the structure of ejiao demand is impacting our health. Like, it almost has a negative effect on African health as much as it's having a positive effect on Chinese health. That's all. Like, there was just such an interesting nexus of trade and so on.
Yeah. So this is the ejiao, and so the whole substitution. I mean, there's this whole thing about animal medicines and like what, and like, can you grow animal tissues in the lab? And then there's, I don't think that, like, people talk about this, animal rights activists talk about this, and that I just don't think it's going to work, because in Chinese medicine, you don't grow things in the lab and put it into drugs. It just, like, that kind of approach won't work. I don't think. I mean, maybe they're doing that with they're doing it with bear bile. Like, for bear bile, they do some sort of synthetic replacement, and the consumers actually are going for it. And this is so that's interesting. But for ejiao, I don't see it right now, but who knows? So the other thing that I think is a really, really interesting point you made about this, because of the pharmaceuticalization, we need to do counter campaigns, like you said. Like, we have famous Chinese personalities doing photo shoots and advertisements and sponsored by UNEP and so on and so forth for saving the animals. And it has worked relatively well for certain big mammals, such as well, ivory, for example. It's not a neat story, but it's like it does have some effect. And there is a growing awareness in China of the plight of elephants and so on. So why not for ejiao? And so the one problem that we're facing is you can't do these campaigns without the government. But and so here's the catch: Dongwu ejiao is the Chinese government. It's owned by a global conglomerate that is based in Hong Kong, and that is called Huarun. And that is owned by the central government. So as it stands right now, you will have to convince the Chinese central government that it should cut its profitable ejiao business in order to save its even more profitable Africa business.
Yes, that's the crux. That's really the crux. It's like that this might be lucrative there, but actually the net long run impact, even for China, honestly, like, I was stunned. I was truly stunned when I was in Ethiopia, just the depth, you know, like, I showed those photos. This donkey has thousands and thousands and like twice longer than ejiao has been produced in China. More than twice that length the donkey has been playing its current role in those villages and in rural areas and in trade and in religion and so on from Ethiopia to wherever. And it was just that trade. And if the trade can be perfectly regulated, and I've heard some Chinese say yes, but the regulation issues are at the Africa end. But to be honest, that's sort of imperfect, because, you know, like when you're trading with very poor countries, you can't, and the donkeys are in the poor parts of poor countries, and they're in areas of few people, low population density, all the rest. It's very, very hard to regulate those areas. And even if it's Africa's regulatory problem, this will still have negative spillovers for China. That's just a simple truth. Like, whether even if the problems of regulation are African, the spillover will come back ultimately. Just that ground level revolt, or that ground level disgust that I was so shocked to learn of, will ultimately feed back up into China. So I hope somewhere behind the scenes, especially for this China-Africa Trade Forum in Changsha, I just hope that there's a quiet dialogue going on between Shandong and Dung Ejiao and whoever the African officials are going, African traders. I just hope there's a new dialogue going on that can produce a much more bilaterally workable arrangement.
Okay. So now we have 3 more questions came up. So I'll turn to them. So an anonymous question is, what happens to the donkeys after their skin are used to produce ejiao?
I'm really not an expert in that. From what I understood, I only know a bit about what happens when the donkey is stolen. And when the donkey is stolen, often the hide is just the first place it can be safely from a theft perspective, killed. Then maybe the skin will just be removed and the donkey will just be left, like the bones, the meat, the flesh will just be left somewhere near the village it was stolen from. And that creates a kind of a biohazard, like a rotting and a parasite problem that shouldn't necessarily be in that location. So there is a bit of a kind of a donkey carcass left in village issue where donkeys get stolen. I think some of the meat maybe where, I think Natalie knows more about this, in the Kenyan abattoirs, they maybe take the skin off, send the skin to China, and then the donkey meat might be used for animal feed or dog food or other sorts of products in Kenya. I don't think all parts of the donkey are wasted, even though China only buys the donkey skin from Africa. China does buy donkey meat from Brazil and Mexico maybe, but it doesn't buy donkey meat at the moment from African countries because there's no phytosanitary agreement for that. So they only take the skin from Africa. And in the case of illegal trade, the rest of the donkey becomes a biohazard waste. In the case of the legal trade, I think some parts are used otherwise and the rest are as properly disposed of as they would be. But Natalie would know more about the rest of the donkey in China.
Yeah, also about Africa, actually. So when I was in China at the donkey conference, then there was an Egyptian vet showing a video of a desert where the donkeys' carcasses were dumped. And that's not from illegal slaughtering. They were just dumped in the desert. It was just literally like kilometers and kilometers of donkey carcasses that are not disposed of properly. And that's like a huge environmental hazard there. And that's the one concern. The second concern is a lot of these countries are actually Muslim, and donkey meat is not halal. So it shouldn't be consumed. And there's a huge concern about this meat going illegally into the meat chain there and being sold off as cow meat and so on. It's also in Pakistan, actually, just because you have this huge amount of meat there. Donkey meat is like, it's red meat. You couldn't, like, as a consumer, you probably wouldn't be able to tell it apart from, it doesn't have any specific donkey smell or whatever. So that's
yeah, I think it's eaten in Botswana and a few other countries traditionally, just not en masse, not as a main consumer meat, but it is eaten like they're in Africa where it's not Muslim. I think there are some customs of eating it, but not on an unsustainable scale, and not slaughtering donkeys for the skin or anything. Like, first and foremost, the donkeys are an animal that has traditionally at least served the village.
So in China also, donkey meat is traditionally eaten in some provinces. I mean, well, it's probably eaten everywhere, but there are some provinces that really pride themselves in eating donkey, and they have donkey burgers and so on and so forth. And they've been having them for a long time. But now, along with this expansion of the ejiao industry, they're also trying to push the health benefits of donkey meat, and they're developing a donkey meat industry alongside that. And so you have all these new restaurants spring up. They're having like donkey hot pot and selling, like there's like donkey hot pot and donkey this, donkey that, and especially Donghu ejiao, they're implying like gourmet cooks to turn donkey meat into all kinds of, like, I mean, really delicious things. I've eaten them. I mean, donkey meat is actually, so this is an interesting, I don't know, because I'm obviously not, like, it's not my expertise, but I think there's probably some truth in what they're saying, because so they are developing their donkey farms, right? And they're saying that the donkey, it basically eats, like, it doesn't need as much feed as a cow or a pig. It's actually a very environmentally friendly animal. It lives on shrubs. It eats the rubbish of the small scale farmers, so they can sustain it on like a few pennies a day. And it gives very high quality meat. So that this is kind of their storyline, that it produces far fewer emissions than beef. And it could actually be something quite beneficial if it was done in the right way. So,
which is the same reason the poor have relied upon it, because it's just so low maintenance.
Yeah, no, in China, it eats the corn stalks, the yumigar, when they grow the corn, and then the stalks get left behind, and that's what the donkey eats. And that if the donkey doesn't eat it, it needs to be burned.
Yeah, wow. So I think, should we look? What is David Shin?
We need to. There's two more questions. Thanks for a powerful talk. It's from Iman Wang Iman. Thanks for a powerful talk. There has been discussion about replacing animal products in TCM. Do you think that kind of discussion could be mobilized to reduce the demand for donkey skin? I think we've kind of gone over that. Yes and no. So then another one from David Shin. Beijing Genomics Institute has successfully cloned miniature pigs and has also been sanctioned by the US for its technological advances, even possibly ahead of Western genomics. It would seem a simple problem for BGI to tackle. BGI is a private corporation, and perhaps central Chinese government subsidies might be needed. Yes, I mean, that's correct. It's just like, would there be a market for it, right?
Yeah, I think everyone wants the original donkey, so to speak, but
I mean, this is kind of where what I will be saying in my publications is more about, it's not actually about what is in the donkey skin at all. There's a lot more cultural, it's basically, there is a lot of cultural significance in eating this. So it's less about what it is, but what it signifies. And if you reproduce it, I don't know, if you can sell everything and repackage everything, and it might work. I'm not saying it may not work, but like right now, it takes its power from being this very traditional thing. It's totally constructed, actually. So historically, the earliest ejiao wasn't made from donkey skin. It was made from pig skin and cow skin. Why? Because they didn't have donkeys in early China. Donkeys only became popular after 600.
Wow, and they originally were domesticated in East Africa. So it really doesn't make sense to take this full scale back to East Africa and destroy the origins of that use of donkeys.
So then we have one more comment again from Ray Tikia. The issue of donkey hide should be seen from a planetary perspective, which sees one chi flowing through heaven and earth, humanity and the non-human community, which includes animals like the donkey, plants, and other living organisms. think that's probably a good way to conclude this talk.
Yeah, we both definitely agree. And even just those pictures I showed of the role of the donkey in those villages, like it's just such an embedded natural part of the village. The idea that it would be taken out, and those donkeys, the poor can't even afford to have their donkeys spend a lot of time breeding. So that's another reason why they don't produce a lot of foals, at least in this context of them being working animals in Africa, because they have to work just like people. You have to give them maternity leave, so to speak. And that doesn't, they don't do that very often. They can't afford it. And so the idea of just kind of taking the donkey out of that ecosystem, that's a slightly more artificial version of the bigger kind of Gaia type version Ray is mentioning. But just this, even the more micro everyday reality of taking the donkey out of that ecosystem is also a shock that I think is negative for China and for Africa. So I hope there's a quiet discussion going on. And since this paper came out, I know now there's a couple of people researching this topic at Peking University newly. So I hope that will start feeding into an evolving donkey narrative and story between China and Africa that works for both of them, so both sides can get what they need. Okay, is that?
So I don't know. So I think that probably we are over time already, and if there are no other questions, then let's end this talk with giving a big applause to Dr. Lauren Johnston.